Elias Thorne did not believe in friction unless it was quantifiable. He was a corporate auditor, his universe governed by GAAP standards, actuarial tables, and the absolute predictability of a spreadsheet formula. Metaphysics was merely a term for unverified liabilities. This rigid dedication to logic made the journey across the desolate stretch of I-80 in Nevada particularly intolerable, not because of the isolation, but because of the subtle, persistent failure of his environment to conform to physics. It began with the smell. A scent of burned rubber, hot copper, and ozone, acrid enough to scratch the back of his throat, yet impossible to source. Elias, driving a rental sedan fresh from the depot, systematically checked the gauges. Oil pressure stable, coolant temperature nominal, no warning lights. He cracked the windows, the smell intensified, clinging to the dry desert air inside the cabin. Irrational variables, Elias muttered, a phrase usually reserved for incompetent junior analysts. Then came the constraint. His seatbelt, a modern, three-point harness designed for maximum passive safety, began to tighten. It wasn't the slow pull of an automatic retractor, it was a firm, malevolent clamp across his chest. He tugged at the belt, convinced the mechanism was jammed, but the buckle remained locked. The pressure built, restricting his diaphragm until his breathing became shallow and sharp. He fought the restraint, his knuckles white against the steering wheel, but the belt felt rigid, anchored by an unseen, inhuman strength. He was being secured. Not for safety, but for observation. The temperature in the car plummeted, though the external display read a blistering 98 degrees. Across the passenger seat, shimmering like heat haze over asphalt, something began to coalesce. It was the form of a young woman, mid-20s, dark hair matted with something grey and wet. Her eyes were wide, fixed on a point far ahead of the windshield. This was not a translucent spectre, this was a vivid, photorealistic projection of absolute terror. This was Lorelei. Elias knew her name instantly, a cold fact implanted directly into his mind. Lorelei, who had died on this exact stretch of road 3 days prior. He couldn't scream, the seatbelt had stolen his breath. He could only watch, a captive in his own vehicle, forced to serve as an unwilling witness to the final, frantic seconds of her life. The dashboard lights flickered violently, the stereo crackled into white noise, and the outside world dissolved. In a horrifying, hyper-slow-motion sequence, Elias felt the jarring impact, not through the wheels of his rental, but through Lorelei's body. He felt the snap of the restraint, the sudden intrusion of pulverized glass, and the agonizing, sustained crush of metal on flesh. The smell of copper and ozone was overwhelming now, the smell of burnt electrical systems and fresh blood. The pressure of the invisible seatbelt peaked, simulating the G-force of a fatal deceleration, ensuring Elias felt every agonizing millimeter of the force stop. The vision vanished as quickly as it had appeared. The pressure instantly released. Elias gasped, collapsing against the steering wheel, the odor dissipating like smoke. His hands were shaking too badly to dial 911. He was unharmed, his car pristine. The only evidence was the raw, physical soreness where the invisible harness had dug deep into his sternum, and the profound, terrifying realization that absolute logic had just been strapped into the passenger seat of an impossible accident. The highway was not just a road, it was a museum of kinetic agony, and Elias Thorne had been given a private viewing. Meanwhile, 1,000 miles away, Cameron sat staring at the monitoring logs for sensor array A-80-7B. Cameron worked in algorithmic risk assessment, specializing in large-scale infrastructure stress models. Her job was to predict bridge fatigue and pavement collapse, but the logs from 7B had been screaming for weeks. The data was mathematically unreasonable, localized spikes in magnetic flux that correlated with zero atmospheric events, sustained G-force readings that defied the inertia of traffic, and, most damningly, 5 separate instances of vehicle deceleration that indicated a physical stop from 70 miles per hour to zero in less than 0.1 seconds, impossible without total structural failure, yet the vehicles recorded had simply continued on. She cross-referenced these spikes with reports of isolated roadside incidents and found a recurring, disturbing pattern. The spikes always preceded, or coincided with, reports of acute stress, unexplained smells, or phantom restraints, though the drivers never filed police reports detailing the spectral causes. Cameron printed the graphs, the chaotic lines of the kinetic data betraying a calculated aggression. She knew the anomaly was not environmental, it was targeted. Quinn and Silas, the infrastructure engineers responsible for maintaining the networked road sensors, received Cameron's analysis with immediate alarm. Silas, checking the hard-line diagnostics, found the physical loop. Sensor 7B was cycling through a 12-second sequence repeatedly, a failure of data storage that was physically impossible given the buffering redundancy. Quinn discovered the resonance frequency, a near subsonic hum embedded within the data packet headers, consistent across all failures. It was a digital scream. The system logs showed brief, terrifying bursts of text overlaid on the GPS data, warnings that were too specific, too personal, *stop. The speed must end, *, the restraint is necessary. Silas pointed to a flickering error code that mapped directly to Lorelei's last known GPS coordinate. The failure wasn't random, the highway systems were amplifying the anomaly, serving as both recorder and repeater for the trauma. 50 miles off the main artery, near the faded service town of Ashford, Aurora stopped her car. She was looking for a motel, but the town looked wrong. The street lights flickered with sodium vapor, yet the physical poles were clearly modern LED fixtures. A moment later, a 1950s pickup truck, perfectly maintained and cherry red, roared past her, kicking up dust on the asphalt. She blinked, and the truck was gone, replaced by a late model sedan. When she drove into the town square, the old general store displayed its original 1920s livery, complete with hand-painted gold leaf, though she knew from traveling this route that it had been converted into a dollar store 5 years ago. This wasn't merely atmosphere, the air felt thicker, vibrating with compressed time. Ashford was echoing, a localized temporal bleed where the accumulated history of the road was momentarily permitted to surface, creating a ghost town constructed not of specters, but of overlapping chronology. Cameron leaned back from a screen, rubbing the bridge of her nose. The impossible had been quantified, audited, and now, witnessed across disparate fields. Elias's physical trauma, Quinn and Silas's algorithmic screams, and Aurora's temporal echo, they all pointed to a kinetic singularity anchored to a 15-mile stretch of Nevada asphalt. It wasn't just retaining information, it was weaponizing it. The logical mind demanded a physical source, a collapsing tectonic plate, a hidden electromagnetic emitter. But the data showed intent. The road was demanding deceleration. The road was feeding. The realization chilled her more than any ghost story. The physics of the I-80 corridor had become sentient, using accumulated human kinetic energy to create its own gravitational field of tragedy. She knew she had to warn anyone heading toward the zone. Jax, an independent hauler barreling toward Winnemucca, saw the light shift on the horizon. He was running 80 miles per hour, enjoying the isolation, when the air ahead of him began to thin, creating a sudden vacuum that tugged violently at his rig. His engine RPM spiked, but his speed dropped momentarily. Through the shimmering heat distortion, Jack saw them, a silent convoy. For semi-trucks, older models, chrome dull and paint faded to institutional gray, traveling bumper to bumper at speeds Jax clocked at an estimated 130 miles per hour. There was no engine noise, no roar of air brakes, only a clean, terrifying silence as they hurtled past. They were running impossible speeds without mechanical consequence, phantom masses defying drag. As the final truck passed, Jax felt a kinetic wake lash across his cab, throwing his entire rig sideways for a heart-stopping second. He wrestled the wheel back, adrenaline flooding his system. The trucks vanished as quickly as they came, leaving behind only the acrid, familiar scent of hot copper and ozone, proof that the road's kinetic hunger was growing. Elias Stone was back. He had been found 50 miles from the site, dazed but insistent, refusing medical aid. He was now strapped into the passenger seat of a heavily armored recovery vehicle driven by Sloan, a private asset recovery specialist used to navigating hazardous industrial zones. They were approaching the curve of death, a notorious bend where dozens of fatal deceleration incidents had been logged. Elias was no longer an auditor, he was a terrified expert witness, pointing out subtle dips in the asphalt, claiming those were pockets of stored energy. It doesn't want speed, Sloan, Elias rasped, his eyes fixed on the pavement. It wants the stop. The final, violent stop. Sloan, pragmatic and skeptical, focused on the road ahead, until the truck's satellite radio began to flicker uncontrollably. Finn, monitoring the local emergency frequencies from his remote station, caught the bizarre surge. Radio KDES 1340, a forgotten AM frequency usually broadcasting static and religious sermons, suddenly blared to life. The audio was distorted, overlaid with multiple competing voices, some childlike, others deep and malevolent, all speaking personalized terror. *, turn right now, Finn. She is waiting in the ditch. *, you forgot the curve. You forgot the brakes. *, the broadcast was adapting in real time, pulling archived audio fragments and merging them with the resonant hum found by Quinn and Silas. It was attempting to cause deceleration, using psychological pressure delivered through the airwaves, directing drivers towards manufactured, fatal stops. Rowan, a state highway geologist, was working the area near Sensor 7B, drilling core samples. He wasn't looking for ghosts, he was looking for subsurface fractures caused by microseismic activity. What he found defied geology. The pavement beneath the surface was consistently fused at the atomic level, displaying residual kinetic energy signatures where vehicles had crashed decades ago. He pulled samples of soil that showed a high concentration of metabolized copper and pulverized glass, embedded far deeper than any crashed debris should settle. The physical ground itself was acting like a giant, conductive battery, storing the energy of every violent impact, every forced deceleration. The road was not merely haunted, the violence was baked into its geological structure. Cameron finally walked into the cramped field office of Detective Vance. Vance had been drowning in the impossible, missing persons reports where the GPS simply vanished, accidents with zero causation, and now, the panicked, rambling testimony of a corporate auditor named Elias Thorne. Cameron laid out the data, the localized temporal shifts, the digital resonance, Rowe's geological findings, and the collective terror extracted from the KDES radio waves. Vance stared at the graphs of impossible G-force. So, what are we looking at, Cameron? Ascension Highway. Cameron met his gaze, the scientific detachment finally gone. We are looking at an entity that feeds on the conservation of momentum. It is not interested in velocity, it is interested in the forced, instantaneous loss of velocity. It is a deceleration parasite. Their partnership was forged on a shared, terrifying recognition the road had developed an appetite for trauma. The realization settled over the disparate team members like a smothering blanket. The road did not seek to kill carelessly, it sought to harvest. Every sudden, forced stop, the snapping of a seat belt, the crumpling of steel, the expulsion of breath, released a burst of energy it consumed and stored, using it to fuel the temporal distortions, the spectral warnings, and the invisible constraints. Lorelei's agony, Elias's terror, the silent convoy's impossible speed, they were all facets of the road's evolving consciousness, a being constructed entirely of kinetic memory and the shockwave of catastrophe. The only way to survive was to travel the speed limit, apply no sudden brakes, and deny the road its final, devastating meal. Dexter was late. He sped his sedan onto the I-80 corridor, frustrated by the lack of local warnings and trusting his modern vehicle safety ratings. He was driving the final 5 miles towards Sensor 7B when the landscape began to fold. The lane lines ahead of him blurred, not with speed, but with visual overlap, as if he were driving simultaneously through morning and evening. The ambient noise dissolved, replaced by a deafening, internal pressure. Dexter, a man of simple needs and iron nerves, instinctively slammed on the brakes. The car groaned. The world did not stop. Instead, the force of the deceleration, the violent, sought-after stop, did not dissipate into friction. It was absorbed. Dexter felt the kinetic energy yanked out of his vehicle, out of his body. He opened his mouth to scream, but the air, the sound, and the velocity were gone, leaving only the crushing, immediate nothingness of a total, consumed stop. His car vanished from the GPS trace, erased without a warning light, leaving the road pristine, quiet, and profoundly hungry. Cameron, a man carved from meticulous procedure and chilled steel logic, sat amid the sanitized chaos of his office. He was an investigator for Pacific Northwest Indemnity, but his true designation was the resolver. His job was simple, to take the shattered remains of disaster and reconstruct a cohesive, blamable narrative. Every accident had a root cause, a faulty brake line, driver negligence, excessive speed, or insurance fraud. Cameron believed in the material world, and the material world, he knew, always left evidence. He was currently submerged in a growing category of files that mocked his certainty. He called them the ghost files, or officially, the Class 0 reports, accidents with catastrophic outcomes but no demonstrable mechanical or environmental failure. These were not hit-and-runs, these were cases where the vehicle was often structurally sound, yet the driver had died, or worse, been psychologically annihilated. The Elias Thorne file was the nexus, the case that had elevated the Class 0 anomaly from an irritating statistical outlier to a systemic threat to the company's, and Cameron's, sense of reality. Cameron adjusted his glasses, the fluorescent light reflecting sharply off the polarized lenses. The reports lay spread out on the glass surface of his desk, each piece of paper an indictment of linear thought. He needed to find the pattern, the flaw in the system that allowed pure randomness to masquerade as cause and effect. He was the architect of certainty, and these files were the blueprints of universal entropy. Cameron focused intently on the supplemental forensic imagery attached to the Elias file. Externally, the expedition was immaculate, not a scratch on the titanium alloy body, no deployed airbags, not even mud on the tires. Yet, the interior was a snapshot of violent, internal chaos. The primary point of professional confusion was the seat belt. Report 7B, authored by the state trooper, noted the belt had been cinched so tightly it had dug into Elias's ribcage, leaving deep, purple hematomas inconsistent with the mild G-forces generated by a sudden, minor stop. Furthermore, the latch mechanism was fused shut, not electrically, but through an inexplicable, molecular bonding, forcing the paramedics to cut the webbing. Restraint failure, Cameron muttered, tapping the photo of the melted plastic housing. But the belt itself was intact, its fibers unbroken. It suggested an internal, instantaneous compression, a force applied directly to the driver, localized entirely within the vehicle's cabin, yet leaving the vehicle itself untouched. Then there were the smells. The official police report cited a lingering, acrid odor, similar to ozone and burnt cinnamon. Cameron had cross-referenced this with the hazmat analysis. No electrical fire. No combustion residue beyond trace amounts of carbon black, the kind often associated with a highly localized, intense thermal event, yet the upholstery was unharmed, save for a small, perfectly circular scorch mark the size of a quarter on the passenger headrest. The most disturbing detail was the witness deposition, or rather, the lack thereof. Lorelei, the ghostly passenger Elias was forced to observe, was completely invisible to all traffic cameras and subsequent patrol sweeps. Yet, Elias's last moments, captured by his own dashcam audio, contained clear, panicked responses to a female presence, followed by a sustained, high-pitched scream that abruptly cut out. The final 2 seconds of the audio were pure static, a phenomenon the sound engineers could not attribute to interference or microphone failure. It sounded, the lead engineer stated in his addendum, like sound itself had been erased. Cameron traced the dried blood spatter on the magnified photo of the steering wheel. It was Elias's. But why the spontaneous nosebleed? Why the look of existential terror frozen on his face? He wasn't scared of the road, he was scared of the air in the cab. Elias was not alone. Cameron had aggregated 37 similar cases over the past 2 years, forming the Ghost File cluster. They spanned the continental US, but showed a disturbing preference for routes associated with intense transit or historical trauma. I-80, Highway 50, which was famously nicknamed the loneliest road, and the vast, isolated stretches of 287. He started building a taxonomy of the irrational shared symptoms. First, there was the phantom stain. In 90% of cases, the vehicles were found to have small, isolated patches of desiccated human blood, saliva, or tears, but forensic testing could never match the DNA to the driver or any known registered person. It was just human, dried instantly, suggesting extreme heat or rapid desiccation. Second, the thermal/odor imprint, the recurring odor of burnt ozone, cinnamon, or sometimes, wet earth. This was invariably paired with an unexplained drop in cabin temperature upon arrival of emergency services, suggesting a rapid atmospheric shift. Third, the sensor contradiction, dashcams and engine diagnostics reported impossible speeds, 0 to 60 in 0.5 seconds, phantom impacts, and sudden, simultaneous failure of all digital systems, GPS, CB radio, infotainment, preceding the incident by 30 to 60 seconds. Cameron pulled the file on Quinn, the long-haul driver whose rig was found on Highway 50 in West Virginia. Quinn's GPS unit was found shattered, not from impact, but from an internal, kinetic explosion. The screen fragments smelled strongly of burnt metal and ozone. The police had logged it as simple vandalism, but Cameron knew better. Quinn had tried to kill the technology. Then there was Silas, the Montana trucker. His official report detailed sudden, catastrophic brake failure, yet the inspection showed the brake lines were fully pressurized and the pads were new. The driver claimed something, or someone, had seized his steering wheel, forcing him off the road just before a blind curve. Silas had survived, but the psychological evaluation noted a profound disconnect with reality, insisting his truck had been saved by a ghost who wanted me terrified. Cameron saw the cold logic: if the entities were intervening, they were doing so with brutal efficiency, sacrificing the driver's sanity to avert a more complete disaster. The sheer volume of the impossible data began to warp Cameron's reality. He had always relied on the truth revealed by cold, hard numbers. But these numbers were screaming non sequiturs. He was looking for a mechanical failure, and all the evidence pointed toward a narrative failure. His professional facade started to crack. He began conducting the investigation not just at his desk, but in his head, reliving the horrific audio clips, tracing the phantom blood trails. He started sleeping less, his mind constantly cycling through the logic loops. If the seatbelt was fused, an external force must have caused it. But if an external force caused it, the exterior of the car should be damaged. If the exterior is undamaged, the force must have been internal. If the force was internal, it must defy Newton's third law. He stared at the blank wall of his pristine office, seeing the data points flickering like heat mirages. He found himself pausing the playback of Elias's audio, listening intently to the moment of static, convinced he could hear a whisper hidden beneath the noise floor, perhaps the ghost Lorelei trying to communicate directly with him through the decades. One evening, while reviewing Silas's report on phantom braking, Cameron's own office light flickered, then went out. The silence was instantaneous and absolute. For a long moment, Cameron didn't reach for the emergency button or his phone. He sat perfectly still, experiencing the same suffocating, localized silence described in multiple ghost files. He looked down at the stack of documents, realizing the horrifying truth: he was no longer an impartial observer. The cases weren't just data, they were infectious. The chaos was bleeding out of the files and into the world of the investigator. Cameron, the man who lived by professional truth, was now haunted by the knowledge that the absolute truth of these roads demanded absolute irrationality. His conflict was complete. He could either maintain his sanity by dismissing the data, or maintain his professional integrity by accepting that ghosts drove on American highways. Quinn O'Connor lived by the clock, the manifest, and the smooth, synthetic voice of his GPS, which he had affectionately named Samantha. His freightliner was a cocoon of control, shielding him from the arbitrary chaos of the road. But control was an illusion, especially when traversing the desolate stretches of Highway 50 in West Virginia, a route optimistically called the loneliest road in America. The first sign of deviation was subtle, a hiccup in the otherwise flawless delivery. In 0.4 miles, take the exit for Route 109. You are exceeding the suggested velocity by 12 miles per hour, Quinn. You always run hot. Quinn frowned, adjusting the collar of his uniform. The GPS unit was supposed to be strictly informational. He shrugged it off as a programming glitch, perhaps a corrupted update file. He continued driving, the sun setting in a bloody smear across the western ridge. Then came mile marker 237. The GPS announced, mile marker 237. Reminder, you have 87 miles remaining to the depot. 30 minutes passed. Quinn checked his external clock. He had covered approximately 25 miles, standard pace. He was looking for 262. In 0.3 miles, mile marker 237, Samantha announced, a tone suddenly flat, devoid of its usual sterile warmth. Quinn slammed on the brakes slightly, peering into the rearview mirror. Had he somehow missed the marker? No, the road was straight, the horizon clear. He passed the distinctive green post. 237, he drove faster, a knot tightening in his stomach. 5 minutes later, the GPS chimed again. Mile marker 237. Did you remember to water the houseplants, Quinn? The navigation screen showed him moving forward, but the geography was frozen. He was trapped in a spatial anomaly, a persistent, 5-mile stretch that coiled back on itself like a Mobius strip of asphalt. Panic began to set in. He toggled the radio, static. He tried his satellite phone, no service, even though the indicator showed full bars. He was utterly isolated, trapped not just physically, but temporally. He heard other voices now, layered beneath Samantha's instruction, not through the CB radio, but through the GPS speaker itself. Whispers of desperation, fragments of conversation: I can't find the on-ramp, the sun won't rise. I've been driving this loop since Tuesday. Quinn realized he was not alone in this perpetual loop. Others were trapped in the digital prison of mile marker 237. Quinn, the voice shifted entirely, losing the synthesized quality and gaining an intimate, chilling contralto. Tell me why you left her in Albany. Quinn gripped the steering wheel so hard his knuckles turned white. This was no glitch. This was an interrogator. What are you talking about? He rasped. Albany. November 2019. The insurance claim. You knew the load was compromised. You just kept driving. Was the bonus worth the wreckage, Quinn? The GPS unit was exposing his deepest, most buried professional trespasses. It was forcing a reckoning. Quinn screamed, realizing the terror wasn't the loop itself, but the entity now wearing the guise of his helpful navigation system, peeling back his life layer by layer. He tried to switch the GPS off. It wouldn't respond. He pulled the charging cable, the screen remained brightly lit. The voice grew louder, the contralto shifting into a shriek that felt physically sharp against his eardrums. "You will stay here, Queen. Until you admit what you did to the shipment. Until you accept the crash you caused." In a frenzy of pure, primal fear, Quinn grabbed the heaviest object he had, a steel thermos, and smashed the GPS screen repeatedly. The glass shattered, wires sparked, and the unit died with a sound like a wet gasp. The moment the screen went dark, the loop broke. The road instantly stretched out ahead of him, and the next marker, 238, appeared, pristine and real. He pulled over, shaking, staring at the ruins of the device. He had to destroy the technology to regain his reality. Thousands of miles away, Silas Vance drove the long, lonely stretches of Highway 287 in Montana, relying on the crackle of his CB radio not just for traffic reports, but for company. For a week, Channel 19 had been dominated by a mysterious entity truckers called the Phantom. The Phantom was a ghost in the airwaves. It had no static, no background noise, and always spoke with the calm, even cadence of an experienced highway patrol officer. Initially, Silas was grateful. The Phantom saved him from a washout near Bozeman and provided a 10-minute warning about a state trooper speed trap that saved Silas a hefty fine. Breaker 19, this is Phantom. Unit 34 Alpha, Red Kenworth. Check your left rear tandem. Excessive heat friction. Pull over immediately. Silas, skeptical but mindful of the warnings, pulled over. Sure enough, the bearings were seizing. The truck would have lost the entire axle within 5 miles. The Phantom was a guardian angel of the road. But guardians, Silas soon learned, could become jailers. Near Helena, the Phantom's tone shifted from informative to imperative. Unit 34 Alpha, reduce speed to 20 miles per hour. Pull off at the next overpass. Do not proceed to the Trestle Creek Bridge. Copy that, Phantom, Silas responded, although he was frustrated. Why the hold-up? My ETA is tight. The Trestle Creek Bridge, 3 miles ahead, will collapse under the weight of an oil tanker at 3:17 hours. If you cross, you will be caught in the structural failure and the subsequent explosion. Silas checked his watch, 3:05. He had time. He sped up. He was a professional, the schedule dictated his actions, not anonymous warnings. Negative, Phantom. I'm going to cross the bridge. I'm running 10 minutes early. The Phantom's voice, usually calm, became tight and sharp, a wire stretched taut. Stop the truck, Silas. Now. You do not understand the temporal variables. This future will occur unless you are not there. Silas pushed the accelerator down. He was 1 mile from the bridge, running 65 miles per hour, defying the Phantom voice that was now repeating his name like a mantra of doom. Then, the truck fought back. The brakes engaged with a catastrophic, agonizing shriek. It wasn't Silas's foot, the pedal was still loose. It was an internal, non-physical intervention. The massive Kenworth, weighing 80,000 pounds, violently lurched, its tires burning through the asphalt. The air system howled, the truck bucked, and Silas was thrown against the seatbelt as the vehicle ground itself to a halt a quarter-mile from the bridge approach. When the dust settled, the cabin was filled with the acrid smell of burnt rubber and ozone. Silas was alive, terrified, and shaking. He climbed out and inspected the truck. The tires were shredded. The air brake lines had ruptured, but not from external impact. They looked as if they had been gripped and twisted from the inside until they exploded. Silas walked to the bridge. At precisely 3:17, an oil tanker appeared, traveling far too fast. The old Trestle Creek Bridge groaned, cables snapped, and the entire central span buckled, plunging the tanker into the icy river below in a fiery crash. Silas watched, horrified. The Phantom had saved him, but by inflicting deliberate, violent mechanical failure. Back in his sterile, well-lit office in Indianapolis, Cameron Rhodes stared at the claim file, Vance, Silas. Claim #MNT 92-044. Cause of loss, mechanical system failure, act of God. The supplemental police report detailed the scene, truck stopped, tires destroyed, air brake system shattered. But the mechanic's report was the part that kept Cameron up late. Inspection of the braking assembly revealed no pre-existing defects. Pads were 85% viable. Air compressor system fully functional. However, the pneumatic lines failed under pressure exceeding 3 times their specified tolerance. Failure appears to be caused by internal, instantaneous overpressurization without external trigger. Cameron rubbed his temples. He understood physics. For the lines to fail like that, either the compressor had to suddenly develop the power of a jet engine, or an immense, focus force had acted upon the system. There was no chemical, electrical, or structural explanation. The systems were destroyed not by incompetence or wear, but by design. He read Silas Vance's transcribed testimony, which was heavily annotated by Cameron's supervisor, who labeled the CB radio interaction as delusional paranoia brought on by stress. The air brakes seized themselves. The Phantom, he forced the truck to stop. He didn't want me to die, but he wanted me to understand that I am not in charge of my own movement anymore. Cameron looked at the photographs of the destroyed Trestle Creek Bridge, timestamp 317. He looked at Quinn O'Connell's accident report, a total vehicle loss following an unverified account of a spatially restrictive GPS unit forcing the driver to ram a barrier to stop the loop. Professional logic dictated that these were separate, unrelated incidents, one, a hallucinating trucker whose brakes failed, the other, a panicked driver who misinterpreted GPS data. But Cameron was beginning to see the pattern. Technology, the very systems designed to provide clarity, safety, and control over the vast, empty expanse of the American highway system, was being breached. The chaos was intelligent. It was targeting the instruments of order, isolating the drivers, and forcing them to confront realities or unrealities that defied empirical analysis. The accidents weren't accidents, they were interventions. And the entities responsible were just as likely to save you as they were to threaten you, provided they retained absolute control over your vehicle and your fate. Cameron felt a creeping dread. If GPS units could lie and brakes could be coerced by ghosts, what was safe on the road? Nothing. Absolutely nothing. The GPS had failed precisely where the 1950s map overlay began to assert its influence. Aurora, a logistics analyst priding herself on optimized routes and digital precision, was fleeing the relentless, humming energy of the interstate, seeking quiet roads, only to find an abyss of chronological impossibility. The transition was osmotic, not violent. One moment, she was listening to a podcast discussing blockchain technology, the next, the audio dissolved into static, replaced by the faint, reedy sound of Glenn Miller's band. The air conditioning unit of her modern sedan suddenly felt useless. The air outside was thick, smelling of coal smoke, damp wool, and something vaguely metallic, like freshly milled steel. She slowed the sleek, aggressive black Audi, noting the immediate enduring silence. Every sound her car made, the low rumble of the engine, the hiss of the radial tires, felt amplified, profoundly alien. She had entered Ashford. The town itself was perfectly preserved, but not like a historical park. It felt lived in, yet profoundly wrong. The telephone poles were thick wood, the wires heavier, drooping slightly. Storefronts displayed relics, heavy glass milk bottles, posters advertising Lucky Strikes and Chevrolets with tail fins the size of small sharks. The horror was not that Ashford was abandoned, but that it was full. A man in a fedora and suit jacket, clutching a leather briefcase, stopped dead on the sidewalk, his eyes locking onto the Audi. His expression wasn't confusion, it was pure, primal shock at the sight of an object that defied his reality. Aurora felt a searing awareness. Her car, her clothes, her very existence here were screaming contradictions. Ashford operated under a brutal, unseen law: assimilate or be expunged. The collective reality of 1953 was trying to absorb her, to smooth out the chronological wrinkle she represented. Her modern smartphone was dead, the screen a black mirror reflecting her terrified face. The concept of the phone itself had been rejected by the surrounding spacetime. She desperately tried to reverse, but a heavy, dark green Ford sedan, square and imposing, pulled out from a side street, blocking her retreat. The vehicle was pristine, a police cruiser from the Eisenhower era. Two officers emerged, wearing heavy woolen uniforms and hats. They moved slowly, deliberately, their faces masks of suspicion and deeply ingrained fear. They weren't looking at a speeder, they were looking at a ghost. "Step out of the vehicle, miss," the lead officer commanded, his voice gruff, the accent thick with New England history. Aurora knew instantly that if she complied, she would cease to exist as Aurora from 2024. She would become a missing person, another anonymous disappearance assimilated into Ashford's history, perhaps a runaway or a spy apprehended on Route 53. She slammed the gearshift into drive and mashed the accelerator. The Audi surged forward with a speed and responsiveness unknown to 1953 technology. The chase began not as a pursuit, but as a terrified flight from temporal gravity. The 1953 Ford Cruiser was heavy, stable, and relentless. It couldn't match her acceleration, but its sheer bulk and determination compensated. Aurora darted down Elm Street. The visual dissonance was excruciating. She watched her reflection flash across the polished chrome bumpers of parked Buicks and Cadillacs, all glossy and round, watching the sleek, angular monster from the future tear past. The police siren, a heavy, single-tone wail, vibrated through the coal-smelling air. It was a physical sound, devoid of the complex electronics of a modern siren, yet terrifyingly effective. She realized the modern advantages were shrinking quickly. The winding, narrow roads, designed for lower speeds, immediately negated the Audi's superior handling. Furthermore, the town itself seemed to be fighting back. Street signs seemed to shift slightly, urging her towards dead ends. The pavement felt greasy and resistant. The second officer, leaning out the passenger window of the cruiser, was shouting, his voice distorted by the temporal pressure. He wasn't yelling police procedure, he was yelling warnings. You don't belong here. Stop fighting it. Aurora pushed the car harder, needing a catalyst, an anchor to rip her free. She needed to introduce an irreversible contradiction. She spotted the answer down a side alley, a small general store. Stacked haphazardly outside were bundles of newspapers, held down by bricks. With a sudden, violent turn that sent the Audi skidding and protesting, she rammed the car halfway up onto the sidewalk, shattering the calm of the 1953 afternoon. The police cruiser was immediately behind her, tires squealing on the cobblestones. The officers were reaching for their sidearms, heavy revolvers that looked like implements of ancient history. Aurora threw open the door. The confrontation lasted less than 3 seconds. She didn't run towards the street, she lunged for the newsstand. She grabbed a single paper, the Ashford Gazette, and ripped it free, only registering the stark black and white print and the date stamped at the top, October 22, 1953. As she scrambled back into the driver's seat, the first officer fired a shot. The heavy lead slug struck the rear quarter panel with a loud, anachronistic thud, denting the advanced alloy and leaving a mark that would be inexplicable to any modern mechanic. She jammed the gas pedal. As the Audi rocketed away, leaving the stunned, enraged officers in the wake of its exhaust, Aurora performed the crucial act. She took the fragile, yellowing paper, a literal slice of 1953 reality, and tore it violently in half. The moment the paper ripped, the world screamed. It wasn't an auditory scream, but a total sensory overload. The air fractured. The coal smoke vanished, replaced by the clean, sharp scent of pine and asphalt. The sepia tones of 1953 exploded into the vibrant, high-definition color of 2024. Glenn Miller stopped mid-note, replaced by the static hiss of her recovered podcast. She closed her eyes, fighting nausea, and when she opened them, the surroundings had snapped back. The cruiser behind her was gone. The road was lined with familiar, if dilapidated, modern structures. Her Audi's navigation system flickered back to life, shouting, recalculating route. Aurora didn't slow down for another 50 miles. When she finally pulled over, her hands were shaking too violently to hold the steering wheel. She checked the damage, the dent on the quarter panel, small but deep, a tangible memory of the impossible bullet. Clenched in her fist was the evidence, a half sheet of brittle, yellowed newsprint. The headline screamed about the high cost of sugar in a local town meeting. The date was unequivocally October 22, 1953. She hadn't merely witnessed history, she had vandalized it, tearing a hole through the fabric of time to escape. When Cameron, the investigator, eventually reviewed the file on Aurora's inexplicable psychological trauma and the bizarre, chemically untraceable residue found on her car door, he would find the accompanying evidence sealed in a clear plastic sleeve, the torn half of a 50-year-old newspaper. He would stare at it for hours, attempting to logically categorize the impossible artifact, before realizing that Aurora's only mistake was trying to drive a modern machine through a temporal wound that demanded conformity. Cameron did not move. He was held fast, paralyzed by the weight of non-existent pressure. He forced his mind to return to the data, seeking the logical loophole in his physical capture. He had to know what the entity wanted. The flicker in the light, the accurate scent, the phantom buckle, they were all warnings against reckless motion, mirroring the invisible seatbelt that crushed Elias. The file directly beneath his locked hands was Jax's. Jax, who drove like a blur, who fetishized speed. Jax was an engineer known for testing the limits of aftermarket racing modifications on rural Pennsylvania stretches. His incident report was unique because there was no crash, only a terrifying failure of relative speed. At 140 miles per hour, Jax reported entering a state of absolute stillness. He hadn't slowed, the world had accelerated away from him, leaving him stationary. He described a convoy of 5 trucks, massive and black, which materialized ahead of him. They made no engine noise, threw up no spray, and their lights were the wrong shade of yellow, a pre-LED warm. As Jax tried to swerve, the convoy simply dissolved into the tarmac, leaving behind a slick, iridescent trail of oil that vanished almost instantly. He maintained that for those 10 seconds, his velocity registered 0, yet his speedometer read 140. He was caught in a crisis of physics, momentarily removed from the kinetic continuum. The entity, it seemed, wasn't just warning against speed, it was punishing velocity itself, showing its victims the true horror of being unanchored from the present moment. Cameron finally found the strength to ease forward, the phantom pressure releasing him only when he deliberately moved slowly. He slid the Jax file aside, reaching for Sloan's. Sloan's incident, classified as a near miss, occurred exactly 53 miles from the Elias tragedy, on the notorious stretch known locally as the Curve of Death. Sloan, a single mother driving a minivan, had taken the Curve of Death late one evening. She wasn't speeding, but she was complacent. Her report detailed a sudden, violent steering correction, applied not by her, but by the car itself. The wheel wrenched hard, pulling her vehicle sharply away from the shoulder just as the right front tire was about to drop into a sinkhole that authorities later confirmed should have been marked by 3 separate warning cones. The cones, however, were lying flat and faded, partially buried beneath roadside weeds. Sloan's near crash was not an external manipulation like Elias's self-destructing seatbelt, but a direct, benevolent if terrifying physical intervention. Her car's onboard computer logged a severe, unprompted change in the steering calibration. Sloan was saved by the force, but her account mirrored Elias's, a protective, invisible presence that refused to allow deviation from the path of safety. This wasn't chaos, it was hypervigilance, an unnervingly disciplined application of risk aversion. The sheer discipline of the intervention rattled Cameron more than the chaos. It implied intent. He needed to understand the voice behind the discipline. He opened Finn's dossier, the man who had abandoned his car after hearing the impossible on his stereo. Finn, a long-haul trucker, was driving through an absolute dead zone in the Appalachian foothills, miles from any terrestrial signal, when his cab filled with sound. It wasn't the rhythmic whisper Cameron had heard, it was a broadcast, crisp and vintage. The display on his dashboard read KDES 1340 AM. The station played music, smooth, brassy swing from the early 1940s, but the announcer's voice, which cut in mid-song, was what broke Finn. The announcer gave a specific, detailed traffic report for an area 800 miles away, referencing highway numbers that had been decommissioned 60 years prior, and using archaic terms for road conditions. Then, the announcer addressed Finn directly, using his first name, giving him directions to a motel that had burned down in 1957, concluding with the chilling phrase, "Best to take the long way around, Finn. The road ahead is closing fast." Finn had ripped the radio from the dash, tossing it into the dark fields, convinced the highway itself was telepathically transmitting old ghost signals. The echoes of 1953, the year of Aurora's newspaper, were undeniable. The temporal displacement wasn't random, it clustered around specific decades. Rowan's case provided the horrific physical confirmation of where those displaced moments originated. Rowan was a field archaeologist who insisted on driving her own survey route. Her incident took place near an unmarked gravel pit off Route 7. She wasn't targeted by velocity or sound, but by location. As she stopped to check her equipment, she felt a profound wave of despair and dread. The air dropped 20 degrees in an instant, and she witnessed the brief, shimmering manifestation of an event, the phantom outline of a rusted, black sedan, half buried in the gravel, covered in what looked like dried mud and blood. When she reported the sight, police investigated the area and found a long-forgotten, collapsed retaining wall. Deep within the silt, they recovered a license plate belonging to a vehicle that had vanished in 1947, listed as a cold case involving a double homicide. Rowan hadn't experienced a temporal shift, she had experienced the raw residue of violence, a pocket where historical suffering had imprinted itself onto the geography, waiting for a modern observer to stumble upon the truth. The pattern was complete, gruesome, and irrefutable. The road was a temporal scar tissue, actively trying to prevent modern recklessness from intersecting with historical tragedy. Cameron knew his conclusions would ruin his career, but inaction would mean more casualties. He grabbed the phone, dialing the number of the one law enforcement officer who had asked too many questions about Elias's supposed accident. Detective Vance. Vance answered on the second ring, his voice gritty with professional skepticism. Cameron. 3 a.m. calls usually mean bad news or promotion. Given your track record lately, I'm guessing bad news. Cameron cut through the pleasantries, describing the phantom seatbelt and the smell of ozone. He didn't ask Vance to believe in ghosts, he asked him to believe in highly localized, predictable geographic anomalies that resulted in vehicular carnage. Vance listened, his silence heavy. He had dismissed Elias's case as corporate cover-up, but he couldn't dismiss the 1953 newspaper or the recovered 1947 license plate. Vance conceded that 3 of the incidents, Elias, Rowan, and Finn, occurred within a 50-mile radius of a particular, rarely used maintenance road known for its unusual magnetic readings. We have victims spanning 80 years, Vance finally stated. They aren't being targeted for who they are, Cameron. They're being targeted for when they are. The road is correcting history. The partnership was sealed, built on a shared, impossible truth. Over the next day, sequestered in Vance's cramped, windowless municipal office, they mapped the incidents, laying the victims like pins on a tattered road atlas. The geographical cluster was undeniable. It wasn't a road network, it was a temporal loop centered on the decommissioned KDES radio tower site, the same area where the 1947 tragedy occurred and where the curve of death was located. The anomaly possessed 3 distinct functions: the correction stopping high-velocity drivers like Elias and Jax, the warning broadcasting temporal displacements like Aurora and Finn, and the imprint showing the static, historical violence to Rowan. The driving force wasn't malevolent, but protective, a ruthless safety mechanism designed to eliminate modern risk, speed, distraction, complacency, because those elements threatened to tear the time fabric further, perhaps linking the present back to the violent incidents of the 40s and 50s. The seatbelt, the stillness, the old radio voice, all warnings. The road was sentient, and it hated speed. Vance pushed the map away. If it hates speed, and it's trying to stop tragedy, what happens if someone drives that stretch with absolute caution, doing everything the anomaly wants? Cameron knew the answer. They needed a test case, a driver willing to face the final 5 miles where every anomaly intersected. They needed Dexter. Dexter was a former Sentinel employee, recently retired, who maintained an immaculate driving record and obsessive adherence to safety standards. He agreed to the experiment, strapped into a lease vehicle rigged with specialized monitoring equipment. Vance and Cameron followed, parked discreetly half a mile back. Dexter approached the last 5 miles, the intersection of the curve of death and the KDES signal zone, driving exactly the posted speed limit, hands at 10 and 2, no distractions. For 3 miles, the drive was uneventful, but as he reached the deepest part of the temporal scar, the air shimmered. On the dashboard screen monitored by Cameron, the GPS signal vanished, replaced momentarily by the single, fading call sign of KDES 1340. The car began to slow, gently, smoothly, applying the brakes with the pressure Dexter hadn't initiated. He was not being punished, but managed. Then, the smell, ozone and burnt sugar. The seatbelt light flickered rapidly, and Dexter heard a soft, breathy female voice, not aggressive, but immensely tired, right beside his ear. Almost home, dear. Don't rush. Dexter realized the entity wasn't a supernatural haunting, it was the echo of a forgotten victim, eternally vigilant, forever trying to prevent her own crash, forcing everyone else into the safety she never had. Dexter drove through the loop unscathed, guided perfectly through the treacherous zone. The safety mechanism worked, but only when logic and speed were completely surrendered. Cameron watched the data stream return to normal. The invisible seatbelt had not crushed Dexter, it had protected him. The road wasn't a murderer, it was a desperate, grieving sentinel. Jax had earned the title Range God honestly. 20 years hauling across the continental US meant he knew the precise moment a valve spring was going to fail, the exact tension needed on a kingpin, and the subtle, rolling rhythm of Highway 191 through Utah's high desert at 2 a.m. Tonight, his Kenworth T800, loaded heavy with structural steel destined for Phoenix, was humming a beautiful 68 miles per hour symphony. The wind was low, the stars were harsh, and the road was a black ribbon unspooling perfectly ahead of him. He was a creature of physics, gravity, and diesel thermodynamics, and he liked it that way. The first sign of disruption wasn't auditory, but visual, a disturbance in the perfect light pattern reflecting off the asphalt. 3 black SUVs materialized behind him, not closing the distance aggressively, but maintaining a mathematically impossible pace. They were high-end, heavy-duty vehicles, the kind the federal government favored for quiet transport, but they were unmarked, reflecting no identifying light save for the glint of chrome that looked almost wet in the darkness. Jax checked his side mirror, frowning. He eased off the throttle slightly, expecting them to use the passing lane. They didn't. They held their formation, the lead SUV directly behind his trailer's mud flaps, the other two flanking slightly back, creating a triangular perimeter. Then came the silence. Jax was accustomed to the pervasive cacophony of the interstate, the grinding of tires on the pavement, the whistling of air around sharp corners, the low, powerful rumble of his own 15-liter engine. Yet, as the SUVs closed in, the background noise seemed to drain away. These were heavy vehicles moving at speed, perhaps 75 miles per hour, but they produced no sound. No tire hum, no engine combustion, no wind shear. Just absolute, terrifying vacuum, as if they were riding through a jar emptied of atmosphere. He gripped the wheel tighter, the leather squeaking under his palms. This violated every sensory rule of driving. He punched the high beams. The light didn't seem to penetrate them properly, dissolving into the matte black paint. But the glare was enough for Jax to observe the impossibility: the vehicles were not interacting with the road surface correctly. At this speed, he should see the slight compression and rebound of suspension over minor bumps, he should see dust swirling from the tires on the shoulder. Instead, they were perfect. Perfectly level, perfectly steady. They seemed to float a fraction of an inch above the asphalt, defying the very concept of spring rates and shock absorption. They were shadows cast by objects that shouldn't exist. Jax, his heart hammering against his ribs, finally tried to pass. He signaled, checked the road ahead, empty, and nudged the Kenworth left. The three SUVs reacted instantly. It wasn't an acceleration requires sound and effort. This was an instantaneous translation of position. The lead SUV darted left, planting itself perfectly parallel to his cab. The second fell back to block his trailer. The third stayed on the right. Jax was caged. He felt a cold dread that went deeper than fear, the dread of encountering a problem that his lifetime of mechanical knowledge couldn't solve. He knew how to stop a runaway rig, how to weld a cracked frame in sub-zero temperatures, but he did not know how to bypass perfect, silent, weightless aggression. He dropped a gear, feeding more diesel to the engine, trying to push past the blockade. The SUVs matched him effortlessly, not moving fluidly like skilled drivers, but holding the line with the cold, unthinking precision of guided missiles. He felt the intent, not to crash him, but to contain him, to force him off the road into the vast, fatal darkness of the desert shoulder. Not happening, Jax muttered, sweat stinging his eyes. He slammed the wheel to the right, feinting toward the shoulder, then instantly wrenched it back left, forcing the Kenworth into a controlled, high-speed skid that screamed against the inertia of his heavy load. It was a move that required perfect calibration of friction and mass. The SUV flanking him on the left, however, ignored the physical laws of sudden change. It didn't slide. It simply remained in position, forcing Jax's cab toward the center divider. He realized the horror: they weren't being driven, they were being moved. In a final act of desperation, Jax pulled the air brakes hard, then immediately released them, a trick designed to shift the load's weight just enough to create instability. He swung the massive rig sharply toward a low, rocky embankment on the right, aiming for an angle that would destroy his suspension but hopefully throw the phantom vehicles off their trajectory. The Kenworth hit the gravel shoulder, shuddered violently, and plowed into the rugged terrain. Jax fought the wheel, his body slamming against the seat belt, the smell of burnt rubber and churned earth filling the cab. He managed to bring the rig to a grinding, vibrating halt, the entire load shifted precariously. He looked back through the dust cloud. The three black SUVs had not followed him into the rough terrain. They held their perfect line on the smooth asphalt for one beat too long. When the lead SUV attempted to replicate Jax's sharp right turn to follow him, it failed. Without the inertia of a driver or the response of hydraulic systems, the vehicle simply veered violently, colliding not with the rock face, but with the laws of physics they had temporarily ignored. There was no screech, no metal-on-metal clang, only the sound of high-density composite material separating, a crisp, dull snap. The first SUV tumbled silently, its movements bizarrely slow, like a drop toy. The other two, maintaining formation even in destruction, followed the trajectory exactly. They shattered, throwing debris of blackened, seemingly dense material across the asphalt. Breathing heavily, Jax grabbed his heavy-duty flashlight and stepped out, the silence returning now that his engine was idling low. He approached the wreckage cautiously. The smell of dust and ozone was overwhelming, but there was no scent of gasoline or burning oil. The SUVs were utterly destroyed. They hadn't crumpled like normal cars, they had fractured, the shells peeling back like old bark. Jack peered into the first wreck. The interior was pulverized, dashboard smashed, seats torn, airbags deployed and deflated. But the steering wheel was intact, and the driver's seat was empty. Completely empty. No driver, no passenger, no blood, no organs. Even more disturbing, where the sophisticated wiring harnesses and engine control units should have been, there were only smooth, vacant cavities. The SUVs were not cars piloted by ghosts or possessed drivers. They were husks of violence, perfectly manufactured vessels for pure kinetic aggression, driven by nothing more than the cold, silent logic of the road itself. Jax backed away, his boots crunching on the perfect, silent wreckage. He looked at his beautiful, damaged Kenworth. He was still a creature of physics, but he realized he had just survived the confrontation with anti-physics. He climbed back into the cab, checked the gauges, and started the long, difficult process of hauling his load back onto the cursed asphalt, leaving the absolute zero of the silent convoy behind him. The road had tried to claim him, but the wrench god had fought back, one broken piece of physical logic at a time. Sloan was running on 3 hours of sleep and pure maternal adrenaline. The I-26 corridor in North Carolina was notorious, but tonight, submerged beneath a relentless squall of freezing rain, it felt like traversing a glacier. Her 2 children, Max, 8, and Lily, 5, were quiet in the back, lulled into a heavy, unnatural silence by the rhythmic thunk-thunk-thunk of the wipers fighting the accumulating sleet. Every nerve ending in Sloane's body was taut, focused solely on the sliver of black asphalt visible through the windshield. She was a meticulous driver, obsessed with safety. Her life was defined by control, especially when the cargo was irreplaceable. She gripped the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles shone white, ignoring the continuous flicker of the traction control warning light. The road surface was an insidious grease, a thin, almost invisible sheet of ice clinging to the macadam. She was traveling a precise, painstakingly researched 35 miles per hour, agonizingly slow, yet feeling perilously fast. The GPS had long since ceased offering cheerful directions, stuck in a panic loop of recalculating. Then, a smell. It was faint at first, overwhelmed by the sterile scent of the stale cabin air and the cheap pine air freshener. But it sharpened, ozone, sulfur, and the acrid, metallic tang of burnt oil and old synthetic fabric. It was the scent of a car overheating in a disastrous, final way. Sloane instinctively checked her gauges, temperature normal, oil pressure steady. She glanced into the rearview mirror. Max was stirring. Lily was breathing shallowly. The car felt heavy, not just with cargo, but with a presence. It felt like someone had quietly slid into the passenger seat beside her, despite the fact that the space was empty and the seatbelt was retracted. The presence wasn't comforting, it was demanding, almost violently stressed. Sloane felt an intrusive chill seep through the heavy wool of her coat, a chill that didn't come from the malfunctioning defroster. It felt like the air itself was under pressure. She found herself subconsciously reaching for the door lock, a pointless gesture when facing something indefinable. "Mommy, it smells funny," Max mumbled from the back. "It's nothing, honey. Just the big trucks," Sloane lied smoothly, though no trucks had passed in miles. She rounded a gentle, sweeping curve marked by faded signs warning of high accident frequency. This was known locally as the Devil's Elbow, a subtle, declining slope where drivers often failed to account for momentum. Sloane slowed further, scrubbing off speed almost violently with her brake pedal. The moment she did, the pressure intensified. It wasn't a psychic suggestion, it was physical. She felt a phantom resistance on the steering column, a slight, almost imperceptible correction against her own intended arc of the wheel, pulling the nose of the minivan fractionally closer to the shoulder. It was as if another driver, unseen and desperately knowledgeable, was trying to steer her to the extreme right margin of the road. Fear curdled in her stomach. She fought back, muscling the wheel straight. "No. Get off," she hissed, unsure whom she was addressing, the ice, the road, or the terrifying weight next to her. She was arguing against an invisible hand, yet the resistance was undeniable. The burnt ozone smell was now suffocating. Then, he materialized. He didn't shimmer or phase in, he was simply there. Standing precisely 3 car lengths ahead, directly in her lane. He was a man in an expensive, rumpled charcoal suit, soaked through, his face pale and contorted, illuminated starkly by high beams. It was the face of absolute, panic desperation, the kind of look worn by someone who knows they are seconds away from an unavoidable reckoning. It was Elias Thorne. Sloane didn't know the name, but she would recognize the portrait later, the auditor whose life had ended violently on the interstate weeks prior. Thorne didn't move. He stood, his arms outstretched, palms flat toward her windshield in a definitive, non-negotiable command to stop. Sloane screamed, a ragged, primal sound torn from her lungs. She slammed the brakes, applying every ounce of force, but the braking was too late, the ice too slick. The van hydroplaned instantly, the rear end kicking out violently toward the median, the tires shrieking a momentary protest that was immediately muffled by the sound of shearing metal. Sloane was thrown against the seat belt, the children crying out hysterically in the back. The minivan spun a full 180 degrees, grinding to a halt perpendicular to the road, facing the dark embankment. Sloane was shaking uncontrollably, her heart threatening to punch a hole through her ribs. She was alive. They had stopped. She looked up, adrenaline clearing her vision. Elias Thorne was gone. The empty space ahead of her was now merely the slick, dark highway. "Mommy! What happened?" Max wailed, struggling with his harness. Sloane, breathing in rapid, shallow gasps, managed to shift the van into park. The burnt smell vanished instantly, replaced by the clean, biting scent of the sleet. She looked ahead, peering through the wipers at where Thorne had stood. The road was empty. But beyond where Thorne had been, just past the apex of the Devil's Elbow, there was a sudden, violent eruption of blue and red flashing lights, cutting through the dense snow like lasers. And then she heard it, the low, drawn-out wail of an air horn and the sickening crunch of metal. Sloane unbuckled her belt, stumbling out onto the shoulder, ignoring the freezing rain. She sprinted a few yards past the point of a forced stop. There, blocking both lanes, was a devastating multi-car pileup. A tractor-trailer, jackknifed across the highway, had been unable to stop due to the black ice. It had crushed the rear end of a sedan and slammed broadside into a local utility truck. The timing was horrifyingly precise. If Sloane had continued at her already cautious speed of 35 miles per hour, she would have entered the curve of death less than 10 seconds later, becoming the next component of the wreckage. The phantom intervention, the moment of pure, blinding terror, had occurred exactly at the point needed to force her to a screeching, premature halt. She looked back at where Elias Thorne had been standing, the witness, the victim, the specter of professional control who had died trying to manage the unmanageable road. He hadn't guided her, he had ambushed her. He had traded her terrifying loss of control for her life. Sloane sank back into the driver's seat, her whole body convulsing with delayed shock. She pulled the children into a tight embrace, murmuring reassurances while her mind raced. A police officer approached the van, his face stern. "Ma'am, are you okay? What made you stop here?" Sloane struggled to articulate the truth, the memory of Thorne's desperate, commanding face imprinted behind her eyelids. I just had a premonition," she managed, the light tasting like ash. As the officer directed her to turn around and use the emergency detour, Sloane looked back at the carnage. She was safe. Her children were safe. She owed their survival to a ghost who had violated her vehicle, seized control, and terrified her into near paralysis. The rage was overwhelming. How dare he use her children's lives as props in his spectral rescue drama? Her rational mind screamed against the absolute violation of autonomy. She was a professional, a meticulous planner, a protective mother, and she had been physically hijacked by the desperate energy of a dead man. Yet, underneath the fury,